Today is wiring day for my 1UZ swapped 1989 Toyota pickup. Let me show you what's going on. As you can see here, there's a lot going on that needs to be wired. So here's how it's gonna go. First off, we wanna get the ECU going. We'll start by connecting the ECU to the factory body plugs here, which will supply it with a switched power. We already have the power from the ECU going all the way to the battery, and we already have it grounded. Instead of the fans being on a switch, we are going to get the ECU to send a signal which triggers a relay, which would then power the fans. And while we're on the topic of adding relays, we are going to add a starter relay to the system. Some of these older Toyota trucks, like mine, don't actually have a starting relay, and it can make actually triggering the starter a pain in the butt. It'll just click, click, click. So from the ignition, where in the body plugs the actual start position wire is, which would then send power to this relay, which would then send power to the starter. Also, these body plugs is what is responsible for sending signals to the gauge cluster. So we also need to find which wire in these to tie in the water temperature sensor and the oil pressure sensor. It's actually a lot more complicated than this, but to keep it simple, I figured I'd draw it out as basically as I can, because obviously there's stuff like power, ground, switch wires for the relays, stuff like that that I didn't include. Otherwise there'd be lines everywhere. And they gotta make it all pretty so it's not all annoying and spaghetti of wires underneath the dash and in the engine bay. Won't be too bad. Let's get to work. Alright, so here's what we got going on. These are the two body plugs that I was referencing on the whiteboard. These two wires back here that go to the standalone are responsible for telling the standalone to turn on when the key's on. Oh, hi Phoenix. Hello, kitty, kitty, kitty. And the best wire I found is this guy here, which is black with a red tracer. So we'll tie this guy into this guy using this guy. This is just a standard 2-pin connector. Since there's two wires coming out of this, one end of this will go to that, and then on this side I'll just tie two wires together so that they're both getting fed by the same wire, which should be all right because this wire is a lot thicker than that wire, and the only thing it's responsible for now is telling this computer when to turn on. Alright, so this guy is done. We got the one thick wire to these two wires, which then tie into the ECU switched power. What I like to do is I like to solder all my connections together and then use heat shrink and make it all nice and tidy. I know there's different opinions on whether you should crimp or solder in a vehicle application. I personally like soldering. I think you get a better overall end result as far as the look. And personally, I've never had a solder joint fail and leave me stranded. So I'm sticking with what I know and what has worked for me. Also, something that I've completely forgot that I did is this is the other body plug. This plug actually communicates with your gauge cluster. And you see these two wires that are tied directly into this body plug? One of them would be for the temperature sensor and the other would be for oil pressure sensor. So if we go into the engine bay, we've got the temperature sensor wire right here that would go down to here if I didn't break the sensor when I removed it. And underneath, we got the other wire going to the oil pressure sensor down here. So it turns out I don't even have to touch those. The last time I put the 1UZ in, I made it easy and all plug and play for myself. The only thing that I do need to touch, however, should be the tack output, which is a green wire right here. Now, when it comes to tack wiring on these Toyota swaps, if we go back to this body plug that I said is responsible for the gauge cluster, it's almost always the small pure black wire that is responsible for the tack. So this guy it's got to go to the green wire. And to accomplish that and keep it removable, I'm just going to use a very basic spade connector. That way I can disconnect it if I ever need to pull the harnesses out, and I'll just cover it with heat shrink so it doesn't accidentally short on anything, and if I ever need to pull it, I'll just cut the heat shrink free and disconnect it. And done! I intentionally used oversized heat shrink to tell me to cut this away instead of just cutting the harness in the future if I have to remove it. So if we plug this guy in and turn the truck on, in theory we'll have a tach and we'll have working oil pressure. I know this guy is the starter trigger wire, so... Oh, almost. That's sick. The truck was dead cold and it's still cold in here, so a little bit of a cold start, which is why it struggled. But we have oil pressure and we have a tach working. And if I didn't break the water temperature sensor, we'd have that too. Does the 1UZ sound good? Do you like it? Are you a truck kitty? You wanna finish this up for me? Think you can do that? I think you can do it. Let's talk about relay. The starter relay is partially wired because it did exist in this truck from when I installed it previously. Here it is here. It's tied into the ignition underneath the steering wheel with this blue wire here. We've given it ground to this inner fender, and it shares a power source with this other relay that then goes whoop right to the battery. This relay is what is going to cause those fans to kick on. The ECU sends a negative signal that I would need to tie into here, so instead of grounding it to the body, that wire will go into the cab over to the ECU. But for now, to get this thing cranking on key power, I'm gonna have to run a wire from here into the cab and tie it into this black wire right here. Since the factory starter trigger wire is black and we already got this in the cab wired of black, we might as well keep this trend going and run it from our relay into the cab with black wire. So I'll start by fishing this guy through the firewall grommet here. There it is. So we gotta run this guy over the steering wheel, back through there, and over to there. So we'll pull it through. I think I'll zip tie it up with this wire, follow along this body harness, and send it behind. Same deal as the tach. I used a spade connector here to make this harness removable for the starter trigger wire. In theory, it should be operational. I'd say that worked. Okay, so to finish off down here by the ECU and to finish off those relays in the engine bay, all I need to do is run the last wire to trigger the fan, which is essentially going to be the same as that starter trigger wire I just ran. And if I was smart, I probably would have loomed this together with the starter wire because you need to go from the same place at those relays down to this corner, but I didn't. So I got that guy connected to this yellow wire, which is what sends the signal to ground the fans. Now to give it a test, we will turn the truck into the on position. And if I use a jumper wire on the temperature sensor and just tie both leads together, it'll trick the ECU into thinking that it is 139 degrees, and shortly we'll hear the fans fire up. And now the fan controls for this engine are now the responsibility of the ECU. So I'll no longer have to flip a switch. I'll no longer have to remember to flip a switch and risk accidentally overheating this thing. So that will be a huge bonus to help keeping this thing cool. If we undo the jumper wire, it'll think the ECU is now reading -40 because there's no sensor here whatsoever. Nothing connected, -40. Jumper connected, it shows 139. So I can test both of the extremes. And there you have it. We accomplished all of our goals. The starter is wired, the fans are wired, the gauge cluster is wired. Everything as far as wiring is pretty well good to go on this truck. These wiring videos, it's really, really hard to make it interesting, guys, but right now I'm on the hurry up and wait game. We got a whole bunch of parts coming for this thing that just aren't here yet, so I can't make content and make like noticeable changes to this thing every single week. But we're trying here. I figured at least I can get this out to you guys. So if you want to do me a huge favor, hit that thumbs up button, and hey, consider subscribing. We upload weekly Toyota, building, wheeling, and off-roading content. Anyways, we'll catch you next week. Peace.